let's talk about Greek and Roman architecture. Welcome to Lockdown Learning with myself, Paul Holland. And in this session, what I'd like to do is look at the differences between Greek and Roman architecture. There are clearly lots of similarities. Clearly the Romans were very inspired by the Greeks. We know that in all sorts of walks of life, don't we? The Romans have the same gods as the Greeks, just lots of different names. Lots of their rituals and their customs are taken from Greek culture. And clearly their architecture is also similarly very, very much tapping into the Greek world of the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Romans also drew inspiration from their nearest neighbours, the Etruscans. This was a civilization very, very close to Rome, just to the north, and which dominated Roman political and social life in the early part of their history. And I'd like to show you in this session how, despite the similarities that are there with the Greek style, the Romans also created something different and uniquely Roman. And I hope that this will allow you to spot some of the subtler differences between the Greek and the Roman styles, not just in temples, but more generally as well in buildings beyond temples. Yes, of course, the Romans are at the most fundamental level in their temples using the post and lintel system. This is also called the trabeated system. It involves the verticals, the columns, with the horizontal posts on the top. And of course, at the end, the gable end, if you like, of the roof, there's also a pediment, that triangular shape. And alongside this, we can see that the Romans use for their ornamentation, their decoration, plenty of sculpture that uses the same themes as the Greeks were using, the same mythological stories. There are, of course, times when the Romans use local elements or local stories or myths or connections to make their settlement of the area connect with the local indigenous population. We can see this, for example, in this pediment here in Bath. This particular face, this particular figure is connected with Solis, the local deity. And of course, both the Greeks and the Romans use an altar on the outside of their temples. You didn't go inside like you do into church. Normal public didn't go inside a temple. That was reserved for the priests. The sacrifices were made on the altar in front of the temple. But there are, of course, lots of differences too, and that's what I'd like to look at today. At a superficial level, we have the three orders that the Greeks used: the Doric, the Ionic and the Corinthian. Now, although we do see these pass into the Roman culture, particularly once the Romans have a lot of contact with the Greeks, we do increasingly find less use of Doric, particularly for grand civic buildings. There are some examples. We have a few temples, and we certainly see plenty of a simplified Doric in domestic houses and smaller scale architecture, for example, these here in Pompeii. But the Roman Doric also is a slightly different version anyway. You often find that they use a much more simplified capital here, and with a little ring around it, which is called an astragal. However, although we do see examples of both Doric and Ionic orders in Roman architecture, it's mainly the Corinthian that they took to. Why this is anyone's guess, but one presumes it's because it's grander, it's more elaborate, perhaps it's more in keeping later on with that grand imperial project that the Romans were embarking on. And alongside the Corinthian, we see this new variation, the composite, which is even more complicated, plus a simplified version of a Doric, which is sometimes called a Tuscan order. So the Romans did add their own slightly different styles, and it's very rare, really, once you reach the later Roman period that you see any traditional Greek Doric forms. In many ways, the Corinthian column has become a standardized, grand version of what the Greeks were doing. Again, on a superficial level, the Romans had pediments that seemed to be steeper. Their roofs were slightly steeper, noticeably so. Whether this is because Italy is slightly further north, that's the obvious reason perhaps. The further north you are, the more rainfall you have. That's why roofs are steeper. I don't know, but certainly when you encounter a Roman temple, you'll often find that the pediment is a steeper, squatter triangle than the Greek one. Romans increasingly are seen to use arches in their buildings, and that's something that the Greeks didn't have. It's a Roman invention. It's a clever idea of spanning space with interlocking stones, all held in place by a keystone. It works in terms of creating a structure that can take more weight than the post and lintel system. And we often see arches in conjunction with columns on the sides of buildings, and here you'll see, for example, especially like the Colosseum here, where they've used all three orders. If you look carefully, the bottom story is Doric, the next one up is Ionic, and the top one is a Corinthian, and these columns are serving no structural purpose at all. These are simply decorative, and the Romans are using the arch here to create a structure that stands the test of time. As we can see clearly, it's a strong system of creating large scale structures. And alongside the use of arches in terms of creating strong buildings and strong structures, the Romans are also now using concrete. So we increasingly find that the materials are different. Concrete sometimes, and also brick, and concrete faced with brick or stone or tufa. And finally, on a superficial level, we can see that the Romans also put their temples on a podium. Now, when you look at the Greek temples, they are accessible from all sides. They have three steps, if you like. The top one is called the stylobate, although sometimes people use the word stylobate for the whole platform. And the use of this system means that a Greek temple is not necessarily orientated from a particular end. However, the Romans liked to put their temples on top of a podium, and then the steps would lead up to the front. And although this is a superficial and obvious way to spot a Roman temple, it also underlines something that I'd like to move on to now at a much deeper level, and that is the fact that the Romans were building their buildings with an orientation towards the facade. So you enter the building from the front. There's a very clear sense of this is the front of the building. So a Roman temple would have had an approach and a sense of an approach. And this means that you as an individual would approach this temple with a sense of this being the front. This is the entrance. And this seems to be an Etruscan feature. This idea of an approach within the temple, and as you climb the podium, you also have a number of freestanding columns within the porch before you reach the main centre of the temple. That's called the cella, and that's the inner sanctuary at the heart of the temple. Here we've got some examples of plans, and we can see that this is the way that an Etruscan temple was designed. We'll also notice, as I say, that if you have a front, you also have a back. And this is another big difference with Roman temples. They tend to have a definite rear to the temple. So here's an example of a very fine temple that survives in the centre of Rome, the Temple to Portunus. And as you can see, it has a clear front, it has a podium that it sits on, you have steps going up to the front. It's an Ionic order. There are lots of elements here that are Greek, but there are also plenty of elements that are Roman. Look at the side. Although it gives the impression of columns all the way around, like a Greek temple, those columns are attached to the building. They're attached to the walls all the way round through to the back as well. We call those engaged columns. And this is a very typical Roman element here that we can see. Roman temples backed onto things. They backed up against the courtyard that they were in, or the sanctuary that they were a part of. And we'll see that in a moment. However, here we've got, again, at the centre of Rome, opposite the Colosseum, we've got a temple which takes this to an extreme. We've got a temple to Venus and Roma, and this is two temples back to back, and you can see this from the plan. And I think this is a good example of the way that the Romans did not consider their buildings as in the round. They were very much to be approached from one entrance and in to the front. And this is all very much part of a Roman approach to creating an experience for the visitor. And I'd like to widen this out a little bit to some of the sanctuaries, some quite early ones actually, where you can see that the Romans are experimenting with vistas and views that create an experience, if you like, almost a journey for the visitor. This is the sanctuary of Jupiter Anxur at Terracina, just south of Rome on the coast. And as you can see, there's not much left of it. The podium survives, it's in very good condition, and as we can see, not only do you approach the sanctuary from the front and enjoy the vista of all of these fantastic arches looming above you, but the designer has also created arches in a lateral sense behind the main arches, and these are the sort of views that you can find, all part of a Roman attempt to create a sense of space and a sense of narrative, if you like, or journey to their buildings. Sanctuaries were very much places to draw people in. They wanted the people to come in to have an experience. They were very similar to the sense of a pilgrimage, I guess, in medieval Europe. And so when we look at some of these other ones, here's another one at Tivoli. This is the sanctuary to Hercules at Tivoli. And as we can see from this here, we've got a real sense of theatre and drama, and that's actually emphasised by the fact that one of the ways up into the main sanctuary was in this hemispherical section of the sanctuary, which presumably doubled up as a theatre as well at some point. But I think you can see from this reconstruction here that we have a sense of a journey, a sense of an experience. The visitor would climb up to the next level to see what the next thing was, and then to the next level and have a look at that. And as we can see also, the temple here at the centre, the temple to Hercules, set along the longer side actually of the sanctuary courtyard at the centre, and therefore completely dominating that whole space with its back right up against the colonnades behind. And those colonnades also, as we saw at Terracina, creating long vistas for us to look through and to get the light shining through, creating shadows and a sense of drama and a sense of theatre. Again, not far from Rome, we have the sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia. This is in a place called Palestrina now, and as we can see, a lot of it has been built over, huge amounts of it, just as in Tivoli, a huge amount of it is difficult to work out from what's left over, but we can certainly piece together something of an extraordinary sanctuary that, as you can see from this reconstruction here, would have been the most amazing experience for a visitor, climbing up through various stages, past various vaults and coffered vaults. That means that sort of decorated underneath the vaults, annular vaults, some of them are. That means that they're in circles and semicircles, all the way up to the very top, where one reaches eventually the shrine to Fortuna herself. These ramps had columns going up them as well, and some of those columns have survived. Fragments of them show that the capitals were actually designed to look slanted and to fit in with the slope of the ramp. This is something the Greeks would never have done. The Romans were experimenting here, still using the Greek system of capitals and columns, but allowing themselves to add or change or modify them in a way that made the experience even more dramatic. There you were, going up a slope, but with columns going with you. Even though the columns were vertical, they had to have their sloped tops. It's difficult to see some of these elements now in the modern town of Palestrina, but you can, as you walk around, you can see, for example, here is the theatre, the semicircular theatre, where the Palazzo Barberini has been built around it, but certainly the shapes have been kept, and there's still a sense of an impressive structure that looks out into the landscape beyond. And of course, I'm not saying here that the Greeks didn't have spectacular sanctuaries. Of course they did. But one would have to admit, after looking at these last few examples, that perhaps the Greek ones were allowed to develop in a much more haphazard way and were much more quirky in their layout. Certainly the Romans decided sometimes to create from scratch, if you like, from a whole mountainside, something of a spectacular for the visitor to see. And this idea has been perpetuated throughout history, even into the modern times. Look at this famous monument in Rome that we all know. This is the Vittorio Emanuele monument here at the centre at the heart of ancient Rome, and it was built in the 19th century for Italian national pride, if you like. And I think there's no getting away, is there, from the fact that this echoes exactly the kind of sanctuaries that we've been looking at, that date back all the way to early Roman times, Roman Republican times. And at a smaller level, perhaps we see some of this echoed in Roman forum design, which is very often based around a sense of a long forum, colonnaded marketplace with a temple at the back, backed onto the edge of the forum. And we see this not just in places like Pompeii here and Ostia, but also even in the imperial fora that we have at the heart of Rome, built by later rulers such as Caesar and then later on Augustus and Nerva. And I would say that even later we find in private houses a sense of this same sense of Roman love of journey, of experience, of a narrative. The main entrances to a lot of Pompeii villas have a certain grandeur to them as you go through from the main door into the atrium, and you see the pool there, the impluvium, and the roof open to the sky. But also at a larger scale, perhaps what comes to my mind is Nero's famous golden house, the Domus Aurea. And here we can see this octagonal room, which is not only lit from various angles very cleverly to bring light into certain parts and certain corners that you wouldn't expect, but also a whole series of angled rooms that create vistas from one part of the palace to the other. Again, a sense of drama, a sense of theatricality. Now, obviously, we've moved a long way, haven't we, from the basic temples that we started studying at the beginning of this session, but I hope I've given you some idea of how the Romans took the Greek ideas, worked still within that system of Greek classical orders, but brought their own ideas and adapted them to their own needs, their own society, and their later imperial adventures in a way that makes it something very much their own style. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope that has been of some use and interest to you, and I hope most importantly that you can spot your Roman from your Greek building from now on. Look forward to seeing you again at some point. Thank you. Goodbye.